Finishing a 50-hour game can be inherently emotional. The journeys you take and the characters you meet can stick with you. There's been games I've played in the past with objectively bad writing that I ended up getting attached to through what I have to assume is Stockholm Syndrome. And so for a lot of people, especially fans of the genre happy to see new successes, it can be tempting to declare things as masterpieces or all-time greats based on that initial positive feeling you get after finishing a good game. Today I want to step back a bit from that feeling. 1 month after its release, I want to talk about whether Metaphor was truly as good as those first impressions, whether it's worthy of its place among previous Atlus titles, and what flaws it has that might lead to some people answering those questions with no. 1 month later, let's talk about Metaphor. Hello, my name is ianbits, and this is the first video I've made for Noisy Pixel. One of the video types I wanted to explore here is taking a look at games a short while after their release, after we've gotten some distance from the initial hype. In this video, I'll be looking at Metaphor now that I've had some time to process it after that first initial emotional reaction. This is not a re-review, and I highly recommend checking out the video linked in the description for those looking for that official scored review. This is less about scores and more about a personal opinion. If you enjoy this video, feel free to check out my own channel where I do these types of analytical videos. Metaphor ReFantazio is a fantasy RPG released by Atlus in October of 2024. The studio behind it is technically new, although effectively it's comprised of a lot of ex-Persona devs, including the director and composer from Persona 3, 4, and 5. The simple way to explain it is that this is the game Katsura Hashino has been making instead of Persona 6, with the game being announced all the way back in 2016 on the heels of the original release of Persona 5. And yeah, to be upfront, there's going to be a lot of comparisons to Persona in this video. It's sort of impossible to dance around, and it's an obviously close reference point. The main conceit is the game is a from-scratch reimagining of what a fantasy world can be, moving away from traditional Tolkien-esque fantasy or loose adaptations of mythology and making something unique to this universe. The execution on this is something we'll discuss later, but in general, I'm a fan of the starting point. In this world lies the Kingdom of Uchronia, which is an actual English word, believe it or not, and is kind of on the nose, but I'll let it slide because I had no clue it existed until making this video. The King of Uchronia holds great power because of a magical staff or something, leaving his country in a crisis when he's assassinated with no living heir. You play as a young man sent on a mission to reverse the assassination by killing Luis, a power-hungry military leader responsible for both the death of the king and, several years earlier, his son the prince. Unbeknownst to the rest of the kingdom, the prince survived this attack and has been comatose from the curse meant to take his life. A small resistance guards him and believes that killing Luis will break this curse and allow the prince to return and take the throne. Before being able to carry out the attempt, a giant head in the sky appears claiming to be the deceased king. As he had no heir, he used his nebulous magical king powers to set up a method of determining who would take the throne, which is essentially direct democracy. After a certain amount of time, whoever holds the most support amongst the will of the people, discerned through the aforementioned king powers, will be allowed to take control of the country and the powerful magic associated with it. You're immediately shown the lengths of this magic as your ally is frozen mid-air in his attempt to kill Luis, forcing you to think outside the box and enter the race yourself. In the process, you familiarize yourself with the kingdom and its races, with the plot primarily focusing on the inequalities among the people and the system that led to it. Your character is one of the lesser tribes, specifically an Elda, considered among the lowest of the races because heterochromia is cringe. After an introduction where these events happen and you awaken to the inevitable chosen one power called archetypes, you're left with a situation that's incredibly reminiscent of Persona 5. A dungeon, a deadline, and time slots to either explore said dungeon, level up social stats, or do social link style events. The initial setup makes you think this game is a lot closer to just being fantasy Persona than it ends up being. Let's talk about that before we go further. Fair or not, the big question I had coming into Metaphor was, will it be as good as Persona 5? And while a lot of people might balk at this question, I think it's fair with the caveat that a simple yes or no was only like 2% of the possible outcomes. This big 98% chunk represents all the middle grounds or deviations from that question, including what the answer ended up being for me. No, but it doesn't matter. Because as much as the game wants you to think it's just trying to be fantasy Persona through this first segment, it very firmly becomes its own thing by the end. And this misleading familiarity can lead a lot of people into the wrong sorts of conclusions. Metaphor is a game that seems to be made in a very specific way to me. Namely, coming up with a whole bunch of new ideas and then filling in the gaps with things that the developers already knew would work. The world, the enemy design, and the mechanics all follow this pattern, and it's an odd phenomenon going back and looking at the game and seeing how many instances of this there are. More familiar humanoid races being mixed in with bat people and people who wear cages on their heads. Enemies consisting of your more standard zombies and skeletons, then hideous Hieronymus Bosch-inspired monstrosities that would keep most sleep paralysis demons up at night. Familiar Persona-style mechanics mixed in with new things like traveling around in a weird ship with legs that look straight out of a Studio Ghibli film. In basically all aspects, the philosophy of Metaphor is to anchor the player in the familiar before disrupting with the unfamiliar. Let's talk about the structure first. After that opening section, you gain access to the Legmobile and go on a tour of the major cities in the kingdom. This is the first major deviation in that rather than just the hub city, you actually visit several other locations. These aren't exactly massive sprawling cities or anything, but even from these locations, you'll spend time making excursions to outlying dungeons and villages. Compared to stuff like Dragon Quest or even Tales, there's admittedly not that much to these, but they inject a lot of visual variety and flesh out the areas in between the main dungeons and story in a much needed way. There's also a ton of side dungeons, and they're far more enjoyable than stuff like Mementos from Persona 5 or Tartarus from Persona 3. They aren't randomly generated and again have a ton of visual and atmospheric variety. Crypts, towers, forests, caves, this stuff isn't rocket science, but it makes for a much more fully fleshed experience around the bigger chunks of content. The act of traveling to these areas is also a welcome addition, as the Gauntlet Runner really adds to the sense of adventure. Going outside of it sees the scenery whiz by you, and the cramped indoor spaces give fantasy road trip vibes. Generally, the game will give you a task when arriving at a new city, usually in the form of a dungeon to take care of before you move on to the next city and the next leg of the journey. These sections feel far less formulaic than Persona 4 and 5, as your overall goal shifts very frequently. An early example is the second main town. You visit there with the intention of tracking down a fugitive, but you follow through several smaller dungeons before you even get to the main objective. This section also contains my absolute favorite moment from the game, as my initial worries that Metaphor would lack levity and take itself too seriously were wiped away by a quest objective imploring me to get to the anus. They vary things up just enough that it never feels like falling into a routine. Even if you assume things will end with a dungeon and a deadline, the circumstances surrounding it don't have the inertia of going back home every day to babysit your cousin or get bossed around by your cat. These circumstances also find you engaging in combat pretty damn frequently, so we should probably talk about that. The turn-based combat is perhaps the one area of the game where they really didn't inject a whole lot of original ideas. And so while I certainly enjoyed parts of it, the flaws stand out a bit more without the combat equivalent of weird bat people to distract me. The combat is essentially the standard press-turn combat the main Shin Megami Tensei series uses without many twists. You're given one turn per character, up to a maximum of 4, and you gain an extra turn each time you exploit a weakness or critical hit, while losing turns upon a miss or your attack being reflected or absorbed. The encouragement here is to either keep a relatively balanced party or aggressively swap between setups for each dungeon in order to best exploit the weaknesses of the enemies within. Now technically the combat as a whole isn't just turn-based. It operates on a similar system to Trails Through Daybreak in that you can fight enemies with very simple action combat on the field. Getting enough hits will stun them, allowing you to begin turn-based combat with an advantage. For the weaker enemies or enemies you've out-leveled, you can just beat them down in the field combat to save time. But for most encounters, you'll be operating purely through the press-turn system. The system surrounding the combat will also seem pretty familiar to JRPG fans. The archetype system is essentially just a version of the relatively common class or job system you'll find in stuff like Final Fantasy, Bravely Default, Like a Dragon, and dozens of others. Characters will be able to choose from classes like Mage, Brawler, and Healer, and leveling those classes will unlock new abilities. You'll also have the capacity to inherit a few abilities from other non-equipped classes to flesh out any major weaknesses. The game does a pretty good job at keeping these archetypes varied with their own unique role, although that role can sometimes feel over-specialized to the point that it seems like it's just designed to pass abilities to more well-rounded options. The biggest upside of these systems is how they circle back into the rest of the game structure. Classes are unlocked via social links, giving more weight to the decisions you make with how to spend your time. Combined with how the game takes place over a shorter time period, has fewer social links and fewer stages for each link, you're given fewer decisions that mean more, although if you're a veteran of recent Persona games, you shouldn't have any issue maxing everything out. This is a good example of what I was talking about with familiar anchoring unfamiliar. It uses the previous social link system to introduce and enhance the class mechanics, which differ up quite a bit from Persona or Shin Megami Tensei, even if they aren't really that new to the RPG space as a whole. I'll also mention that the game's use of combination combination attacks, while seemingly minor at first glance, becomes far more interesting when you start getting into the design space of implanting weaknesses. With a combat system centered around exploiting enemy weaknesses, SMT has always had the issue of how to make bosses interesting without being a cakewalk. And implanting weaknesses in enemies, not exclusive to combo attacks but far more frequent there, is a solid shot at rectifying that. It has its own issues, namely when a combo attack has the same damage type as what it's implanting, which means it can just circle around on itself, but I definitely had fun playing around with it once you get to the point where bosses stop having weaknesses. But I mentioned the lack of originality highlighting some issues, and I think it's worth going over those. When I was writing an outline for this video, I just had a list that said unsorted flaws. And while it's not a particularly long list, most of its stuff is related to combat and combat balancing. There's a lot of little quirks surrounding the advancement of classes that added up to things just not feeling quite right on this front. First is the incredibly slow advancement of these classes early on. Taking a while to level up classes early on is fine. It makes sense so characters can find natural roles rather than being an instant party of jack-of-all-trades. But it's still a bit excessive, and as the list of classes balloons to over 40, it doesn't speed up enough to really keep up. The last few archetypes especially take absolute ages to level up, and if you don't enjoy playing as those classes but want later abilities, you'll either have to resign a character to a temporary benching or take advantage of the second quirk of leveling here. You may think to yourself that if you want to level up a character fastest as a mage, you'll need them to be a mage, which is what I thought for most of the game. The game sneaks in a tooltip that job experience past the max level will convert into some form of consumable item that can grant XP to anyone. But what it doesn't tell you is that this exchange rate is 1-to-1. If you gain 1000 experience on a maxed out class, you'll be given a consumable that grants 1000 experience to anyone. In a bizarre way, this leads to a system that discourages experimentation. Leveling up jobs grants temporary stat increases. For example, a level 50 character with a level 20 mage class will have better stats than the same level 50 character with a level 10 mage class. You might have 4 or 5 extra points in magic by the time you've finished leveling that don't carry over to the next class. So optimizing progression is strangely often done in the form of leaving a character on a class they've already finished leveling, in order to feed the unleveled class consumable items while keeping your party strong with the classes you already maxed out. It's weird, it's a weird system. There's more hiccups here as well. As you might expect, certain social links are locked off based on main story progression, especially considering some take place in later towns, so you can't really do those until you get there. But along that track, there's between 1 to 3 additional classes, basically leveled up versions of said class that have stronger abilities. 2 more problems show up here. First, the strength of a leveled up class is almost entirely divorced from where you get it in the story. You'll have stuff you don't get until the last third of the game that feels like it could have been handed to you right after the tutorial without feeling out of place. This can also be frustrating for people who resonate with certain playstyles like the Brawler, who uses HP instead of MP for special moves, and Mage, which allows you to exploit weaknesses at the expense of raw power or AoE, because both of those archetypes hit gigantic roadblocks that prevent you from advancing it until you've reached pretty damn late in the game. Another oddity is that the abilities from the lower tier version of a class don't automatically carry over to the mid or high tier versions. This can lead to bizarre situations like the mid tier swordsman having 0 single target damage abilities, because even the weak starter skill from its predecessor needs to be specifically carried over with an inheritance slot, despite being barely stronger than a basic attack. And that brings me to the last big issue I have, which is the balancing. I'm a massive fan of overpowered crap in RPGs. I love the idea of getting to the end of a progression system or fully understanding how combat works and being rewarded with doing crazy shit that you couldn't have imagined hour 1 when you were spending 4 MP to tickle a skeleton with static electricity. But Metaphor struggles massively in that certain endgame classes are infinitely better than classes of even the same tier when they perform similar roles. The final version of the Mage class sees you rewarded for your efforts with powerful versions of the 3 single target elemental spells. Then you take a look at the final version of the Summoner class, which has versions of the same elements which are not only stronger, but which are also AoE and have additional positive effects for good measure. They also get access to an extremely powerful light spell and the best healing spell in the game. I'll also point out that the final version of the Mage class isn't available until extremely late in the game, and yeah, something is off here. As a whole, these systems lack the polish that so much of the rest of the game obviously exudes. I anticipate that this is an area that will get massive refinement if Atlus decides to do an expanded re-release like Persona 5 Royal or Shin Megami Tensei Vengeance. There's a lot of things to clean up here. With the biggest issues out of the way, let's move on to the most interesting and arguably most well done aspect of the game, which is the story, characters, and atmosphere. Persona as a series was always known for its characters and the dynamic between them, but the execution of the main story itself could be inconsistent in its telling and structuring of the main narrative. Freed from the standard Persona format and setting, Metaphor really shines in its ability to tell a compelling story while simultaneously doing effective and interesting world building. This is also where I think Metaphor does its absolute best in terms of differentiating itself from the Persona series as a whole. Let's start with some of the major themes. While Metaphor is pretty direct in its focus, namely on the inequality between tribes and working to fix built-in prejudice, it can be less focused with its themes in a way that actually works to its benefit. Director Katsura Hashino has stated that the main theme of the game is anxiety, but it's a far less encompassing one than themes from his previous titles. Variety is a major strength here. Divorced from the restrictions of the modern school setting, each party member and social link can have wildly different backgrounds, motivations, and goals. Some of them certainly lean too hard into anime tropes, but many of the follower stories here, especially the non-party members, are so damn good I consider them to be better than anything the Persona series has done with this format. Alonzo and Brigitte are the standouts, but Barton is also a great example of how being able to have characters with more varied situations can result in a more interesting story, even if it follows the standard template of a character losing their way and finding redemption. They're also really well incorporated with the main narrative. The fact that there's actually not that many of them and the fact that they're linked to unlocking new classes means Metaphor can reasonably expect people will see most of them. They're technically optional, but you can tell that a lot of the intended world building was put here, specifically with Katharina and Yufa. They serve more as supplements to the overall plot than isolated stories. The primary narrative centers around your group and their efforts to stop Luis, but it avoids oversimplifying things by making it a pure good versus evil story. Don't get me wrong, Luis is a total bastard, but he's not the only one. Forden, while initially presented as a bit of a lesser evil, is just as dangerous as Luis, as he seeks to maintain the flawed status quo with a shadow government. Combined with Luis pushing a brutal meritocracy under the guise of being for the people, and you have two sides that are hyperbolic representations of a lot of people's fear with democracy. Our protagonists don't operate on the blind idealism that a victory over these two will be permanent, a point the game stresses as it approaches the end. These two villains are examples of points of failure, ones that any free government will always be at risk of. There's actual stakes here, heightened by the fact that our heroes don't get to hide behind anonymity like in Persona. While the story isn't necessarily about saving the world for the entire runtime, it's very clear that failure to stop Luis means the end of civilization, and eventually that failure to stop Forden means unsustainable continuity. All of this wouldn't matter if Metaphor didn't create a world worth saving, but it walks the tightrope of conveying a bleak present while showing enough good that you'll want a happy future. Maria and Yufa especially show the potential of people to move past prejudice and the positives of that. It can make temporary antagonists in the side stories extremely one-dimensional for the sake of brevity, but when it's able to take enough time, like with the second main dungeon, it can result in some great sections that flow seamlessly into the next. There are some imperfections here though. One of the main things is that the focus on progressing the main narrative seems like it clashed with the pacing of gameplay. There's not a lot of main dungeons to speak of, as low as 5 depending on what you count. At one point there feels like another one was intended to happen. In a curious sequence, you visit what looks like it's going to be the next big zone, then just fight a boss in front of it and get given a deadline that is essentially do whatever until this date rather than being asked to complete a dungeon. There's also a pretty noticeable issue with the writing in that this is a pretty predictable game. You can predict just about every twist the game's going to take well in advance, which isn't the end of the world, but certainly reflects at least some amount of lazy writing. A certain amount of that is near unavoidable in a 60-hour game, but it's worth mentioning nonetheless. Lastly, let's talk about the characters. What the main party lacks in raw likability compared to Persona, they make up in diversity of experiences. Hulkenberg wrestles with her failure and how it caused the group's current dilemma. Heisme uses the new goal as a motivation to move past the death of his son. Yufa is more of a blank slate that is learning about the world for the first time, and their social link chains represent vastly different stories to reflect what place they occupy within the world. It's a great cast and they're utilized well, both in the main story and their side stories. Put everything together and Metaphor creates a compelling world, occupies it with compelling characters, and uses them to create a compelling atmosphere. Short of a few minor issues, this is the game's greatest success and what I believe this game will be remembered for. It's tough to really discern what a game's legacy will be early on. Nostalgia is a powerful force, and people can be more critical of flaws with new things as they build up predecessors to unrealistic heights in their head. When I look at Persona 3, 4, 5, and even Shin Megami Tensei 3, I see in Hashino's career flawed games that knew what things to focus and polish. They're all games with obvious flaws that even people who enjoy them can point out. Pacing issues in Persona 5, gameplay issues in repetition in 3 and 4, but they can also easily point to why they loved them. The casts, the stories, the unique atmosphere, the style. For me, Metaphor has that. It has a unique setting and a sense of adventure and combines old and new elements extremely well. It's flawed for sure, and I think in the end it won't resonate with people as much as Persona has. But for people who can get invested, Metaphor is just as good as advertised. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider checking out my channel and please leave a comment. I'm curious what people think about content like this, and I'll probably be responding to just about everything.